Hey there, language learners, and welcome back to another episode of Learning English Studio. I'm Amelia, and I'm so happy you're tuning in today.
Hello, Amelia, and a big hello to all our listeners out there. It's a beautiful day to talk about English, isn't it?
It really is, James. I'm feeling particularly excited about our topic today because I think it's one of those game changers for anyone learning English. We're going to dive into something that can really transform how you experience the language.
Ooh, I love those kinds of topics, the ones that make you go, aha. So what's this magical concept we're exploring today?
Well, we're going to talk about how to think in English, instead of constantly translating from your native language in your head. And we'll be focusing on some easy practice techniques specifically for beginners. But before we jump in, I just want to remind everyone to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this episode with a friend who might find it helpful. Every share helps more learners discover our community.
That's so true, Amelia. Building this supportive community is what makes Learning English Studio special. And thinking in English, wow, that's such an important topic. I remember when I first started trying to do that, it felt like my brain was doing gymnastics.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like trying to reroute all the mental traffic in your brain to a new destination. But you know what? Once you start getting the hang of it, it's such a liberating feeling.
Absolutely. It's like suddenly the English language starts feeling more like a part of you rather than something external you're trying to piece together. So where should we begin with this topic? There's so much to cover.
Well, I think we should start by talking about why thinking in English is so important in the first place. Many beginners don't even realize how much they're translating in their heads until someone points it out.
That's so true. I think most beginners naturally translate everything because that's what feels safe and familiar. But what are the downsides of that approach?
Oh, there are quite a few. First, it's incredibly slow. By the time you've translated what you want to say from your native language to English, the conversation has often moved on. Second, it leads to these unnatural, literal translations that don't sound like how people actually speak.
Oh, I've seen that so many times. Like when someone directly translates an idiom from their language and it makes no sense in English.
Exactly. And third, it creates this mental barrier between you and the language. You're always experiencing English through the filter of your native language instead of directly. But the good news is that even beginners can start practicing thinking in English with some simple techniques.
That's what I love about this topic. It's accessible to everyone, regardless of their level. So what would you say is the first step someone should take if they want to start thinking in English?
That's a great question. I think the very first step is simply becoming aware of when you're translating. Just notice it throughout your day. Oh, I'm thinking about my grocery list in my native language and then translating to English. That awareness is the foundation.
That's such a smart starting point, because once you're aware of it, you can start making small changes. It's like that saying, you can't change what you don't notice.
Exactly. And then I would suggest starting with really simple, concrete things, like naming objects you see around you in English. When you look at a cup, think cup instead of your native word for it. When you see a tree, think tree.
Oh, that's such a gentle way to begin. It doesn't feel overwhelming at all. And you can do it anywhere, anytime, just walking down the street and silently naming things in English.
Right, and then you can gradually expand to simple phrases. Instead of just tree, you might think green tree or tall tree. Instead of just cup, you might think empty cup or coffee cup.
That makes so much sense. Building from single words to simple phrases, and then gradually to more complex thoughts. It's like building a muscle, starting with light weights and gradually increasing.
That's such a perfect analogy. And another thing that really helps is creating little English moments in your day. Like maybe when you're making breakfast, you describe what you're doing in simple English in your head. I am pouring milk. I am spreading butter on bread.
Oh, I love that. It's like creating these little islands of English thinking in your day. And they don't have to be long or complicated, just a few minutes here and there.
Exactly. And the beauty is that these small practices add up over time. It's not about making a huge change overnight, but about gradually shifting your thinking habits. I remember when I first started trying to think in English.
Oh, do tell. What was that like for you?
Well, at first it felt really strange and slow. I would forget words that I actually knew, or I would get stuck trying to form a simple sentence. But I kept at it with these small practices, and one day I realized I was thinking about my weekend plans in English without even trying.
That's such a wonderful moment, isn't it? When you realize the English thinking is happening naturally, not because you're forcing it. It's like the language has found a home in your mind.
Absolutely. And another technique that I found really helpful, especially for beginners, is what I call thought templates. These are simple sentence structures that you can use again and again with different content.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give us some examples of these thought templates?
Sure, things like I want to, or I need to, or I like. So you might think, I want to drink coffee, or I need to buy groceries, or I like movies. These simple structures give you a framework to hang your thoughts on.
That's such a practical approach, because then you're not trying to invent the grammar every time, you're just filling in the blanks with different vocabulary. It makes the thinking process so much smoother.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable, you can expand to slightly more complex templates, like I think that, or I feel that, or I wonder if. These help you express opinions and emotions in English.
That's so helpful. And what I love about this approach is that it's not about perfection. It's about gradually training your brain to work with English patterns instead of constantly translating.
That's so true. And another thing that really helps is thinking in English about things you genuinely enjoy or are interested in. If you love cooking, think about recipes in English. If you're into sports, think about game strategies or player stats in English.
Oh, that's such a great tip, because when you're thinking about something you're passionate about, it doesn't feel like practice. It's just natural thinking, but in English, and you're more motivated to find the right words to express your thoughts.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English doesn't mean you have to banish your native language completely from your mind. That's neither realistic nor necessary. It's about gradually increasing the amount of English thinking you do.
That's such an important point. It's not about an all-or-nothing approach. It's about finding a balance that works for you and gradually shifting that balance towards more English.
Right. And another technique that can be really helpful, especially for beginners, is what I call narrating your day in simple English. It's like being the narrator of your own life, but in your head.
I love that, the narrator of your own life. So you'd be thinking things like, I am walking to the bus stop. The bus is late. I see my friend across the street. I am waving to my friend.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be complicated or poetic, just simple factual descriptions of what you're doing, seeing, or feeling. I am feeling tired today. The weather is nice. I am looking forward to dinner.
That's such a gentle way to practice, and it connects the English language directly to your real, everyday experiences, which makes it more meaningful and memorable.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is setting aside specific times for English thinking. Maybe 5 minutes when you wake up, or 10 minutes during your commute, or a few minutes before bed. Having these dedicated practice times helps make it a habit.
That's such a smart approach, because habits are built through consistency, not intensity. A few minutes every day is so much more effective than an hour once a week.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to have some emergency English thoughts ready for when your mind goes blank. Simple phrases like, I am learning English, or this is good practice, or I am doing my best.
Oh, that's such a great idea, because when you're struggling to think of something in English, it's easy to just switch back to your native language. But having these fallback thoughts keeps you in the English mindset even when it's challenging.
Right. And another technique that I found really helpful is thinking in English about your future plans or goals. Tomorrow I will blah, or this weekend I want to blah, or next month I hope to blah.
That's such a good one, because it connects the English language to your aspirations and dreams, which makes the practice more meaningful and motivating.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to celebrate small victories along the way. Maybe one day you realize you thought through an entire shopping list in English. That's worth acknowledging and feeling good about.
That's so true. Progress in language learning isn't always obvious day to day, but when you look back over weeks or months, you can see how far you've come, and those small victories really add up.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful, especially for beginners, is using what I call thought prompts. These are simple questions or statements that you can use to guide your English thinking.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give us some examples of these thought prompts?
Sure. Things like, what am I doing right now? Or what do I see around me? Or how am I feeling today? Or what do I want to do later? These prompts give you a starting point for your English thinking.
That's such a practical approach, because sometimes the hardest part is just getting started. Having these prompts ready makes it so much easier to begin thinking in English.
Exactly. And as you get more comfortable, you can use more complex prompts like, what did I learn today? Or what am I grateful for? Or what challenges did I face today? These help you reflect more deeply in English.
That's so helpful. And what I love about this approach is that it's not about forcing yourself to have profound thoughts in English. It's about simple, everyday thinking that gradually becomes more natural over time.
That's so true. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your past experiences. Yesterday or last week or when I was a child This helps you practice different tenses and connect English to your personal history.
That's such a great tip, because it makes the English language more personal and meaningful when you can connect it to your own life experiences and memories.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes, forget words, use incorrect grammar, and that's completely okay.
That's such an important reminder, because so many learners put so much pressure on themselves to be perfect, which just creates anxiety and makes it harder to think naturally in English.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful is what I call English thinking anchors. These are specific activities or times of day that you consistently associate with thinking in English.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give us some examples of these English thinking anchors?
Sure, maybe you always think in English while brushing your teeth, or while walking your dog, or while waiting for the bus, or while doing dishes. These regular activities become triggers for your English thinking practice.
That's such a smart approach, because it connects the new habit of thinking in English to existing habits in your daily routine, which makes it much more likely to stick.
Exactly. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your preferences and opinions. I like because, or I prefer to, or I think that is. This helps you practice expressing yourself more personally in English.
That's such a good one, because it moves beyond just describing things to actually sharing your perspective, which is such an important part of real communication.
Absolutely. And I think it's also helpful to have some go-to topics for your English thinking practice. These are subjects you feel comfortable and interested in, so you always have something to think about in English when you're not sure what to focus on.
That's such a practical tip, because sometimes the challenge isn't the English itself, but just not knowing what to think about. Having these go-to topics ready eliminates that problem.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about hypothetical situations. If I had more free time, I would, or if I could travel anywhere, I would. This helps you practice conditional structures and expand your imaginative thinking in English.
That's such a creative approach, and it's so much fun too, because you can explore all these different possibilities and scenarios in your mind, all while practicing your English.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about problems or challenges you're facing and possible solutions. The problem is, and I could solve it by. This helps you practice more analytical thinking in English.
That's such a practical approach, because it connects English thinking to real-life problem solving, which makes the practice more relevant and immediately useful.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English is a skill that develops over time. Some days it will feel easier than others, and that's completely normal.
That's such an important reminder, because language learning isn't a straight line of progress. There are ups and downs, good days and challenging days, and that's all part of the process.
Absolutely. And another technique that can really help is what I call English thinking snapshots. These are brief moments where you pause and capture a thought in English, like taking a mental photograph.
Oh, that's such a beautiful metaphor. English thinking snapshots. So you might be walking down the street and suddenly think, the sky is so blue today, or I smell fresh bread, or that dog looks happy.
Exactly. And these snapshots don't have to be profound or complex. They're just brief moments of English thinking that capture your experience in the moment.
That's such a gentle and accessible approach, because anyone can do this, regardless of their English level. Even beginners can capture simple thoughts in English throughout their day.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your daily routines and habits. Every morning or after work I like to. This helps you practice using English to describe regular activities.
That's such a practical tip, because routines are things we do regularly, so thinking about them in English reinforces the language patterns through repetition.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to remember that thinking in English doesn't mean you have to understand everything perfectly. It's okay to have gaps in your understanding or vocabulary. The important thing is to keep practicing.
That's such an important point, because so many learners get discouraged when they encounter something they don't know in English, but those gaps are just opportunities to learn and grow.
Absolutely. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about your goals and aspirations. I want to become, or I hope to achieve, or my dream is to. This connects English to your future vision and motivation.
That's such an inspiring approach, because when you think about your dreams and goals in English, it gives the language a deeper purpose and meaning in your life.
Exactly. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about comparisons and contrasts. I like more than, or this is similar to, or this is different from. This helps you practice more nuanced thinking in English.
That's such a good one, because it moves beyond just describing things to actually analyzing ideas, which really expands your ability to express complex ideas in English.
Absolutely. And I think it's also helpful to remember that thinking in English is not just about words and grammar. It's about adopting a different way of expressing and experiencing the world.
That's such a profound point, because each language has its own unique way of seeing and describing the world. When you think in English, you're not just translating, you're learning to see through a different linguistic lens.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful is what I call English thinking challenges. These are little games or exercises you can do to push your English thinking in new directions.
Oh, that sounds fun. Can you give us some examples of these English thinking challenges?
Sure. Things like trying to describe your day using only verbs, or thinking of as many words as you can related to a specific topic, or trying to think of different ways to express the same idea. These challenges make the practice more engaging and creative.
That's such a playful approach, and it makes the practice more interesting and less like a chore. I love that.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your sensory experiences. I see, or I hear, or I smell, or I taste, or I feel. This connects English more directly to your physical experience of the world.
That's such a grounding technique, because it brings you into the present moment and connects the English language to your immediate sensory experience, which makes it more vivid and memorable.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to remember that thinking in English is a gradual process. You don't have to force yourself to think exclusively in English right away. It's about finding a balance that works for you and gradually shifting that balance over time.
That's such an important reminder, because so many learners put pressure on themselves to make rapid progress, when really it's about consistent, gradual improvement over time.
Absolutely. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about cause and effect relationships. If then, to because of, therefore, to this leads to. This helps you practice more logical and analytical thinking in English.
That's such a smart approach because it helps you develop more complex thinking patterns in English, which really expands your ability to express sophisticated ideas.
Exactly. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about sequences and processes. First, then finally, or step 1, step 2, step 3. This helps you practice organizing your thoughts in English.
That's such a practical tip because so much of our daily life involves processes and sequences, from cooking to work tasks to planning our day. Thinking about these in English reinforces important language patterns.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English doesn't mean you have to abandon your native language completely. It's about adding English to your mental toolkit, not replacing your existing tools.
That's such a balanced perspective because bilingualism is about having access to multiple ways of thinking and expressing, not about choosing one over the other.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about categories and classifications. This belongs to the category of, or these can be grouped by, or this is similar to. This helps you practice more systematic thinking in English.
That's such an organized approach, and it really helps develop your ability to structure information and ideas in English, which is such an important skill. That's such an important aspect of language learning, because being able to express emotions and feelings is such a fundamental part of human connection and communication.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to remember that thinking in English is not an all or nothing activity. You can think in English for a few minutes, then switch back to your native language, then return to English later. It's about finding a rhythm that works for you.
That's such a flexible and realistic approach because life is unpredictable, and sometimes you need to use your native language for specific tasks or conversations. The key is to keep coming back to English thinking when you can.
Absolutely. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about hypothetical scenarios and possibilities. What if, or imagine if, or suppose that. This helps you practice more creative and imaginative thinking in English.
That's such a fun approach, and it really expands your ability to think beyond the immediate and concrete, which is such an important aspect of language proficiency.
Exactly. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your personal values and beliefs in various topics. In my opinion, or from my point of view, or I believe that, this helps you practice expressing your personal stance in English.
That's such an important skill because being able to express opinions and perspectives is such a key part of meaningful communication and connection with others.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English is not just about the words you use, but also about the cultural perspectives and ways of thinking that are embedded in the language.
That's such a profound point because language and culture are so deeply interconnected. When you think in English, you're not just learning words, you're learning a different way of seeing and understanding the world.
Exactly. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about your problems and solutions. The challenge is, and one possible solution is, or we could address this by, this helps you practice more analytical and problem-solving thinking in English.
That's such a practical approach because it connects English thinking directly to real-world challenges and opportunities, which makes the practice more relevant and immediately useful.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your daily interactions and conversations. I talked to, about, or we discussed, or I explained. This helps you practice reflecting on your communication experiences in English.
That's such a reflective approach, and it really helps you process and learn from your real-life English experiences, which reinforces your learning and progress.
Exactly. And I think it's also helpful to remember that thinking in English is a skill that develops with practice, just like any other skill. Some days it will feel more natural than others, and that's completely okay.
That's such an important reminder because so many learners get discouraged when they have a difficult day with English, but those challenging days are just part of the learning process, not a sign of failure.
Absolutely. And another technique that can be really helpful is thinking in English about your personal values and beliefs. In I value because, or I believe that is important, or my philosophy is, this helps you practice expressing what matters to you in English.
That's such a meaningful approach, because when you can express your deepest values and beliefs in English, the language becomes truly yours, a tool for expressing your authentic self.
Exactly. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your learning process itself. Today I learned, or I'm improving at, or I need to practice more. This helps you practice metacognition, thinking about your thinking in English.
That's such a meta approach. But seriously, it's so valuable because it helps you become more aware of your learning process and more strategic about how you approach your English practice. Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that thinking in English is not about achieving perfection overnight. It's about gradual, consistent progress that accumulates over time.
That's such a realistic and encouraging perspective because it takes the pressure off and allows for a more sustainable and enjoyable learning experience.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your achievements and successes. I'm proud of, or I accomplished, or I improved at. This helps you practice acknowledging and celebrating your progress in English.
That's such a positive approach, and it's so important for maintaining motivation and confidence in your language learning journey.
Absolutely. And another thing that can really help is thinking in English about your future self and who you want to become. In the future, I will be, or I'm working toward becoming, or I imagine myself. This helps you practice expressing your personal growth and development in English.
That's such an aspirational approach, and it really shows how language can be part of your broader journey of becoming the person you want to be.
Absolutely. And I think we've covered so many great techniques today for thinking in English. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up, James?
I think the main thing I'd want to emphasize is that thinking in English should feel enjoyable and empowering, not like another chore on your to-do list. Find approaches that work for you, that connect to your interests and your life, and that bring you joy.
That's perfect to end on, because when you enjoy the process, you're much more likely to stick with it and make real progress. Thank you so much, James, for sharing all these wonderful insights today.
It's been my pleasure, Amelia. I hope everyone feels inspired to start thinking in English, even in small ways. Remember, every thought in English is a step towards fluency.
Absolutely. And now it's time for our favorite part of the show, where we get to hear from you, our wonderful listeners. We have a little challenge for you today that we think will help you practice thinking in English.
Oh, I love this part. What's our challenge for today, Amelia?
Well, we want you to try one of the techniques we discussed today for thinking in English, and then tell us about it in the comments below. It doesn't have to be anything complicated, just a simple practice that you tried and how it felt for you.
That's such a great challenge. And to make it even more interesting, we have 3 options for how you can share your experience with us.
Option 1, tell us about a specific technique you tried for thinking in English. Did you try naming objects around you, narrating your day, using thought prompts? How did it feel?
Or option 2, share one thought you had in English today. It could be as simple as, I see a blue car, or I feel happy, or I want to drink tea. We love seeing these little English thoughts from our community.
Or option 3, tell us about a challenge you faced when trying to think in English and how you dealt with it. Did you get stuck on a word? Did you find yourself automatically translating? How did you handle it?
And don't worry about making mistakes in your comments. Remember what we talked about today. Thinking in English is about practice, not perfection. We just love hearing from you and seeing your progress.
Absolutely. And we'll be reading all your comments and cheering you on. Remember, every small step in your English thinking journey is worth celebrating. We're here to support you every step of the way.
That's right. And don't forget to subscribe to Learning English Studio if you haven't already, and share this episode with a friend who might find it helpful. The more the merrier in our supportive community.
Perfect. Well, that's all for today's episode of Learning English Studio. Thank you so much for joining us, and remember, start thinking in English, one thought at a time. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Happy English thinking.